Now, it may sound like a bit of a bold claim, but one engine helped change the course of World War II, but when you look at the evidence you'll see that it has a lot of validity. But it wasn't the only good engine around at the time. So how is it that the Rolls-Royce Merlin was seen as the engine that won the war? Now, just to clear things up, the engine isn't named after the legendary wizard Merlin, but rather the Merlin, Britain's smallest bird of prey, which is a type of falcon and known as a swift flyer and skilled hunter, which is rather apt considering the type of planes it ended up in. Rolls-Royce named their inline aero engines after birds of prey, and the Merlin itself can be traced back to the Kestrel, the company's first cast block engine, which itself came from the Curtiss D12, first developed in 1921, and one of the first truly successful cast aluminium block aero engines, which would influence engine makers in England, Germany and America. The reason why an inline V12 was used instead of a typical air-cooled radial engine, even though they were heavier and more complicated to cool, was that an inline engine has a smaller frontal cross-section with less drag, allowing slimmer, more aerodynamic and ultimately faster planes to be built, such as the Supermarine S-Series racing seaplanes. These seaplanes were powered by the Rolls-Royce R and won the Schneider Trophy on multiple occasions, and were the inspiration for the iconic Supermarine Spitfire, also designed by R.J. Mitchell. The V12 configuration, which is essentially two straight-six engines mated together, inherited the straight-six's natural balancing and smoothness, making it ideal for the relatively light and fragile airframes like the Spitfire without shaking them apart. But inline engines in a plane have a problem with cooling. A rotary has all the cylinders in the airflow, but an inline narrow-angle V configuration engine only has the first two cylinders at the front exposed, with the rest behind them, so they have to be liquid-cooled. However, liquid-cooled engines also have the advantage of being more efficient at removing heat and working better at high altitudes where the air is thinner. This allows them to be in a higher state of tune and to use superchargers and turbochargers to produce more power with up to 100 octane aviation fuel, which was to prove crucial in the high altitude dogfights and for high altitude bombers. By the early 1930s, the highly developed Kestrel engine was near the maximum output that the design could achieve, and Rolls-Royce were looking for a future engine. The Air Ministry wouldn't invest any new funds into the engine, so Rolls-Royce committed company funds to develop a new 27-litre engine and called it the PV-12, or Private Venture 12, because it was without government funding. In the mid-1930s, the PV-12 was still a problematic and relatively unreliable engine, but in 1935 it received a huge development boost when it was chosen to power the Air Ministry's new high-speed fighters, the Spitfire and Hurricane, and its name was changed to Merlin. From then on, its reliability steadily increased and the performance was aided by a new supercharger, and by the outbreak of war the Merlin II was producing just over 1,000 horsepower in the Spitfire and Hurricane Mark I. Because of the huge volume of air the supercharged Merlin used at full power, and with the open exhaust gases exiting at some 2,100 km per hour, it was realised that useful thrust could be gained by simply angling the exhaust gases backwards with ejector exhaust stubs instead of venting out sideways. Experiments with different exhaust stubs produced a speed increase equivalent to 150 horsepower and helped hide the exhaust flash at night, something that would not have been possible if a turbocharger had been used instead of the supercharger. This new combination of a powerful, lightweight, narrow engine and the Spitfire airframe created a formidable fighter that could outmaneuver and out-accelerate the opposition. It was also used in the Hurricane, Lancaster and Mosquito aircraft, and eventually as a unitised power unit for 45 different aircraft, including the Bristol Beaufighter, the Bolton Paul Defiant II, the Handley Page Halifax and the Vickers Wellington. This one-engine, many-planes approach allowed the relatively simple-to-build Merlin to be mass-produced in shadow factories across England, Scotland and later under license by Packard in the US, whose production expertise would be key to its successful mass production. But the Germans also pushed ahead with their developments and in 1941 introduced the Focke-Wulf FW190A with a 42-litre radial BMW 801 engine, which could outpace the Spitfire in climb and speed. However, within weeks the Merlin 61 was introduced with a much improved two-stage supercharger developed by Dr. Stanley Hooker. With less weight and now more power, the Spitfire Mark IX could outperform the FW190A and maintain the edge. The Spitfire's other main adversary was the Messerschmitt Bf109E, fitted with the 34-litre Daimler-Benz DB601 inverted V12. This had an advantage over the Merlin in that it used a mechanical direct fuel injection system, whereas the Merlin used twin float chamber SU carburetors. This meant that in a dive, the Merlin could cut out for a few seconds due to the mixture leaning out from negative G, something that could prove deadly in aerial combat. The problem was solved by an engineer at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, Farnborough. Beatrice Tilly Schilling developed a simple flow restrictor and carburettor diaphragm to mostly cure the problem just in time for the Battle of Britain. Eventually, an injection carburettor would be developed by Bendix to fix it once and for all. The Merlin engines also proved to be very resilient in battle. There are many accounts of Merlin-powered bombers losing half of their engines to flak or fighters and flying home on the remaining ones at full power boost for hours with no sign of distress, which was far longer than recommended by Rolls-Royce. When Britain entered the war in 1939, it was using 87-octane fuel whilst the Germans already had 100 octane. Even though the UK was able to produce high-octane fuel in limited volumes in the 20s and 30s for the Schneider seaplane races, it was not able to mass produce it by 1940. Rolls-Royce tested the Merlin with 100 octane and found that it allowed 135 horsepower in extra boost. By the time of the Battle of Britain, the US Standard Oil Company had cracked mass production of BAM 100 or British Air Ministry 100 octane fuel and sent it over in tankers just before the battle. This proved decisive. The 100 octane fuel allowed the extra boost from the supercharger to give the Merlin a performance edge to the Spitfire and Hurricane, enabling them to down enough German planes in the 3-month campaign to convince the German High Command that daylight raids on RAF bases could not be sustained, and switching to the nighttime raids in the beginning of the Blitz instead, but effectively saving the RAF. Later in 1943, a new 120 octane fuel was introduced and boosted the Merlin 66 to 1,560 horsepower. This gave the Merlin 66 powered Mark IX Spitfire and Mosquito the speed to intercept the V-1 flying bombs at low altitude. Later development of the Merlin and the fuel at 150 octane provided 2,000 horsepower engines, all with the same 27-litre block. It wasn't only fighters that would benefit from the Merlin. In fact, most of the Merlins produced went into the Avro Lancaster heavy bomber, which used 4 of them. From 1942 onwards, the RAF mounted increasingly larger nighttime raids, leading up to the 1,000 bomber raids on German cities, industrial areas and key military targets. The Lancasters also were responsible for destroying the Mona and Ida dams with the Dam Buster raids. They sunk the battleship Tirpitz with a 12,000-pound tallboy bombs and badly damaged V2 production at Peenemünde. Further development of the Lancaster allowed it to carry the Grand Slam 22,000-pound bombs, the largest of the war and the most powerful non-nuclear aerial bomb ever used in combat up until the American Moab in 2017. However, when round-the-clock bombing started in 1943 with the US 8th Air Force operating daylight raids and the RAF operating nighttime ones, the US losses rapidly began to mount up on raids deep into Germany where there were no fighter escorts. The US theory of heavily armed self-defending bombers flying to the target with little in the way of fighter escort was repeating what the Luftwaffe had done 3 years earlier against Britain, and with losses increasing to 27% in October 1943 and 34% of the planes that made it back having to be scrapped, the 8th Air Force was forced to stop until a solution was found. But the answer was soon at hand when the Rolls-Royce research establishment at Hucknall installed a Merlin 65 into a North American Aviation P-51 Mustang. The resulting airplane's performance led the way to replacing the existing Allison engine with the US Packard-built Merlin, creating the iconic Mustang P-51B, C and eventually D, also known by the RAF as the Mustang Mark III. This transformed into a plane that will be able to take on and beat the best German fighters at low or high altitude thanks to the Merlin's two-stage supercharger, and providing air support to the US bombing raids from England to Germany and back again with its 1600 km or 1000 mile range. Soon after the introduction of the P-51 to escort duties, bomber losses dropped dramatically. However, when Major General James Jimmy Doolittle took over command of the 8th Air Force, he allowed the P-51s to go after the Luftwaffe fighters and not stick close by the US bombers. The plan changed from protecting the bombers at all costs to destroying the fighters. The bombers would be the bait and the P-51s would go after and destroy the German fighter force to achieve air superiority. This and the use of other Merlin-powered Hurricanes, Spitfires and Mosquitoes allowed the Allies to gain air superiority over most of Western Europe and mount the D-Day landings with confidence. It also enabled them to bomb key targets at will as the war progressed to destroy German industry and military. Over 168,000 Merlins were produced, with over 55,000 of those coming from the US Packard factory. An unsupercharged version of the 27-litre engine block was also used to power tanks and called the Meteor, and the Sea Merlins powered some naval craft. But its main use as an aero engine is what made it decisive. In the months after the Battle of Britain ended, Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder of the RAF was asked about the Battle of Britain and replied, "Three factors contributed to the British aerial victory: the skill and bravery of the pilots, the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, and the availability of suitable fuel. Without the mass production of the Merlin that allowed the 1,000 bomber raids of the RAF with the Lancasters and the USAF with the support of the P-51, the war would probably have dragged on much longer, and England might not have been in a position to become the staging post for the D-Day landings, and the war in the West would have been very different." So now we can see why the Merlin is called the engine that won the war. So thanks for watching, and don't forget to check out some of our other videos if you get the time, and please subscribe, thumbs up and share.